one of the basic skills you have to be successful on the SAT and the ACT is you need to do the math related to using exponents. They show up in things like quadratic equations, they're going to show up in functions, and you just need to know how to deal with those. So let's do a quick refresher exercise. To begin with, look in your book and you'll see some practices. Take a look, x to the 0. X to the 0 is always 1. Any number to the 0 power is always 1. So even 7 to the 0 power is 1. So keep that in mind as you take the test. Now, what can you do with x cubed plus x to the 4th? There's nothing you can do with that. You can't add them. You can't take bases that are the same x and add them together. And that's why you see, for example, in the quadratic equations, you see x squared plus x minus 7 is because you can't add the x squared and the x. So you can't do that. Likewise, you cannot subtract the same base with different powers. So you have to leave that. But you can multiply them. Look at x cubed times x squared. Anytime you multiply the bases that are the same and they have different exponents, you just add the exponents together. So 3 plus 2 is x to the 5th. How about dividing? Well, isn't dividing the opposite of multiplying? So we're going to do the opposite thing. So we added them together before, and when you're dividing, you subtract. So x to the 9th divided by x to the 3rd is 9 minus 3, which gives us x to the 6th. Now, here's a wrinkle. What about x cubed to the 4th power? So that means x cubed times x cubed times x cubed times x cubed. And shorthand would be to take x cubed to the 4th, so 3 times 4 is x to the 12th. Or you could have done it the long way. You could have added those 3's together 4 times, and that would have given you that as well. But the easy way to do it is just multiply the power with the x to the power that's on the outside of the parentheses. Then x to the minus 4th. Dealing with negative exponents is often difficult, and it leads to making mistakes, because when you're multiplying exponents and you've got a negative one, or especially if you're dividing and you have a negative one, you forget to deal with the sign. So my recommendation is to take negative exponents and make them positive, and all you have to do with something like x to the minus 4th is put it in the denominator, leaving 1 as the numerator. So you can see that x to the minus 4th is exactly the same thing as 1 over x to the 4th power. Now, what about simplifying x squared, y squared? Well, isn't that the same as the quantity x, y, in parentheses, squared? Why is this one so important? Well, I have it in my book because what happens a lot of time on the test is you're going to get something in your answer like x squared, y squared. You look in the multiple choice answers and it's not there. And why is that? It's because they've simplified it to the quantity x, y squared. So watch for that. So just because you don't quite see your answer among the multiple choice answers doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that they're expressing it differently. This is pillar 2. It's restating the given information. You've got one piece of information that looks different, but it means the same thing. So watch that carefully on the test. Then you might see something like x to the 3/2 power. Well, what in the world is that? Well, it's fairly simple. If you'll remember, the power is up, so it's x cubed, and the root is down. So that's the second root, so it's the square root. So you could rewrite that as x to the 3rd power all under the radical sign, and you put the 2 out there just to remind you, but you know that the radical itself, without anything out there, means that it's the square root. So you could really just write this as the radical x cubed. Now, an easy way to remember that, a student told me about this. She said the way she remembers it is power up your engines, so powers go up in the numerator and roots go down on the ground, so they go down in the denominator. Now, let's take this information and apply it to a couple of problems. Look at question number 1 in your book, and it's asking you t to the x over t to the 5th power equals 2, and m to the z power times m cubed equals m to the 5, and then it says multiply x times z. Well, fairly straightforward. What do you do when you're dividing exponents? That's exactly right. You subtract. So what number x minus 5 gives you 2? So x has to be 7. And in the other case, what plus 3 gives you 5? Well, that's 2. So m to the z is really, z has to be 2. And then x times z would be 2 times 7 is 14. That's answer C. Circle it in your test booklet, bubble it in, move on. Let's take question number 2 next. It says, if t is a negative fraction, what's answer below must be true. Well, you can see that they're looking for t to the 1st power, t squared, and t cubed. So they're asking you to put them in the order from the greatest to the least. So the easiest way to do this is to substitute numbers. You remember we talked about changing algebra to arithmetic, changing the abstract to the concrete. Well, you won't make a mistake if you use a real-world number rather than the t. So it says t is a negative fraction. I think a pretty easy negative fraction would be negative 1/2. We'll set that equal to t. Then we'll square it. Negative 1/2 times a negative 1/2 is 1/4. And it's positive because a negative times a negative is a positive. And then t cubed would be 1/4 times negative 1/2. So that would be 1/8. But we got to remember it's negative because negative times a positive makes it negative. So what we have is t is negative 1/2, t squared is 1/4, and t cubed is negative 1/8. Well, now we can answer the question. Right off the bat, we see that 1/4 is the only positive value, so that has to be the largest number. That immediately eliminates A and D. Now the question is, which is larger, negative 1/2 or negative 1/8? Knee-jerk response for lots of students is negative 1/2 is larger, but it isn't, because you've got to remember we're on the other side of the number line. So if you just draw a number line, you see that 0 is here, negative 1 is here. Negative 1/2 would be halfway between those two, but negative 1/8 would be way over here. So negative 1/8 is actually larger because it's to the right on the number line. So we come up with t cubed as being the largest of the 3 values. We circle C, bubble it in the test booklet, and we move on. So that's a quick review of exponents, and we'll be playing with these in lots of our lessons in the future, but you've got to know the basics before you can be successful on those future activities.